Good afternoon and welcome to the College of Continuing and Professional Studies webinar, Embodied Communication. Thank you so much for joining us today. Next slide, please. It's a pleasure to have you all here this afternoon. My name is Shanta Bulai, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. If you have future questions about this webinar or other programs we offer, the college's contact information will be on the last slide of this presentation. I am delighted to introduce a topic for today's webinar, embodied communication. Too often, we are speaking in front of colleagues, peers, or stakeholders. Our nervous system engages in the fight, flight, or flop response, leaving us anxious and tongue-tied. We know what we want to say, but our body gets in the way. During this hour-long session, you will be learning ways to recognize the stress response and then dismantle it using both physical and verbal techniques. It's time to step out of our own way and harness your personal power to get your point across with skill and ease. In this webinar, we will cover the importance of acknowledging the moment at hand and discovering the gifts it holds, ways to release counterproductive judgment and convert it into useful curiosity, social engagement techniques that foster connection and reduce self-consciousness, and accepting controversial mindset and challenging our zero-sum narratives allows us to adapt the dynamic circumstances. And lastly, the use of humor and play as means to enliven our presentation skills. It's a pleasure to introduce the presenter for today's webinar, Jim Robinson. Jim has 3 decades of experience, both as a psychology professor and as a professional improviser and actor. His workshop, Improvisation and Mental Health, evolved from his work in both fields and recently was the basis of his Fulbright Specialist Project and Citizen Diplomacy Action Fund, both in Pakistan. Jim, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will pass it over to you.
Oh, thank you. And I want to make sure I have my mute off, right?
Yes.
Good. Well, this is embodied communication, so you could just, watch me and it would have been probably just as good. Anyway, thank you so much for having me. Before we launch into this, I want to say a couple things just about myself. And as Shanta said, and I appreciate that introduction, I have spent a lot of time, over 30 years, teaching psychology, but also either being an improviser or a sketch comedian or teaching improvisation, all of those things. And all of those have started to blend in my mind and also in my career. And I thought I would just say a couple things about what drew me to this topic and what brought me to this event today. Like Shanta said, I taught psychology primarily at St. Kate's and St. Thomas, but also at the U. And in that course of that, I taught a lot of developmental psychology and looked at how children develop connections and attachment to other people, how language developed, how play played such an important part in the development of ethical standards and ethical approaches to life, how it helped them with their strategizing, and particularly how it helped them with their self-concept. So while I was doing that, I was also working at night at the Brave New Workshop, the longest running satirical comedy theater in the country, and doing a lot of improvisation after the sets, or after the shows rather, and then using improvisation as a way to create and write our material for our shows. And I began to see a real overlap between the information I was talking about in class having to do with attachment and connection with other people and with play theory, and how this was really connected to what we call the improvisational mindset. And from there, I took this information, created the class that Shanta talked about called Improvisation and Mental Health, and then began to work with social workers and with pastoral care facilitators, with law enforcement, about how we can connect with people who are in crisis. And that then evolved into this this interest that I have in what's called embodied communication. And the thing that really drew me to it is that with embodied communication, which is sometimes called body language, but it's really much more than that. With embodied communication, we use our 5 senses, we use our voice, we use our carriage and our posture, we use the muscles in our face, we use particularly the muscles around our eyes and in our forehead to send out cues to the people that we're talking to. This can be a conversation between 2 people, it can be a presentation in front of a large group of people, it can be on a Zoom call from my wood-paneled cave. Anyway, the point is, with embodied communication, it does seem to be absolutely critical in ways that we're often unconscious of. one thing that I often will talk about with my students is that in order to get your material across, in order to uh, do justice to the content, you have to connect first. And I hope this presentation will not be one of those presentations where you don't think about the content, but instead you think about the way that perhaps I stammer or the way that I might move too much, or you'll begin to focus on that stuff. So in order for this to work, I have to make a connection with you. You have to make a connection with me. And once that happens, and if my presentation is in line with my content, then we will we'll be able to really benefit from this. So, having said that, let me talk a little bit quickly about what embodied communication is. Embodied communication, like I said, is when we use our whole body, our five senses, the muscles in our face, the dynamics in our voice, as a way to connect with other people. Sometimes it's also referred to as embodied listening. And this is stuff that we all know about. I mean, everybody, for the most part, can tell when somebody's engaged with them and when they're not. And they often can't tell if someone's engaged by what the person says. Instead, they'll know if a person's engaged by their eye contact, by their ability to lean forward or to push back. We pay a lot of attention to our face. We'll be talking about this today, but how we send out cues that are either inviting or that set definite boundaries, or that can even be threatening. And if we're unaware of that, if we're unaware of how we use our body and our voice and our face, we will be at odds with our material. So what I thought we would do, and this is going to be very, very strange, although as we go into 2024 and we're more in the Zoom universe than ever before, this is becoming the way of our lives. I thought we would begin with just a little embodied exercise. Normally, I have people stand up and shake out their whole body, and as a group, we count together and we look at each other and we smile and we laugh, and there's really nothing that beats that. But there are things we can do within the confines of our little Zoom window. So if you can, what I'd really like you to do, please, is I'd like you to take your three middle fingers and I'd like you to place them as high as possible on your cheekbones. So obviously not in your eye socket, not down here on your cheeks, but up here on your cheekbones. And I'd like you to hum as high as you can in the highest pitch possible. Now, I can't see you. I don't know if you're going to do this. I hope you'll give it a try. So here we go. And I will do it very quickly with you. Here we go. You can keep moving your fingertips around your cheekbones just until you can really begin to feel the vibration of your high-pitched hum. I promise I'll tell you why we're doing this once we've done it. One more time. And then I'll demonstrate, and then we'll all do this together, I assume. I'm going to go from the hum to a spoken pitch. It'll be a high pitch, almost like a chant. And I'm going to leave my fingers on my cheekbone, and then I'll tell you why we're doing this as an opening. So here we go. Put your fingers on your cheekbones, please. Do the high-pitched hum, and then open your mouth. You should be able to feel this. You should be able to feel the vibration in your fingertips. One more time. What we've done, and we're going to talk about this, is we've just done an embodiment exercise. And the point of this is manyfold. First of all, if we were doing this together, we would have created a sound that somehow connected all of us. But since we're doing this individually, we're also finding a way within our own little space here on Zoom to get into our body. And that might feel strange. Maybe you enjoyed it. Maybe it felt really good. But whenever we use our voice, whenever we pitch our voice higher in our voice box, higher in our skull, in the empty spaces in our skull, and whenever we begin with a hum that engages our sinuses, and then we open up our mouth and we turn that into a high-pitched voice, we are flexing our ability to use our vocal cords. We're changing the dynamics of our voice. You probably noticed, if you were looking in your camera, that while you were doing this, you were also relaxing the muscles around your eyes and also in your forehead. It's very difficult to do that while your face is is clenched. It's hard to do that while your body is clenched. This is, of course, the basis of chanting. So while you were doing this, your body was relaxing, the muscles around your eyes were relaxing. This affects the small bones in your middle ear. These were all relaxing, and you were entering into a space that was very present and very relaxed. Now, maybe that didn't happen. Maybe you felt silly or self-conscious, and that's totally fine. But what we're going to be talking about today is how doing simple things like that, and I'll talk more about how we do that, can put us in the moment, in our bodies, and we have then access to all of our physicality when we communicate. So let's begin by looking at the slide that we have here about what I control and what I can't. When I talk about embodied communication, and I teach some classes at CCAPS, and I taught a lot of classes through, for example, through the Guthrie and through the Brave New Workshop, and then also on my own, a lot of times people will come in with a very understandable desire to change other people. They'll say, I wish I could find a way to talk to my boss that would make her listen to me or make him listen to me, or I wish I could speak to my spouse in a way that opened up a communication. That is possible. But what isn't possible is our ability to control other people. And so what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about that, but then look at the things that are in our control and how we can use uh, embodied communication to make our communication clearer. So just to begin with, the first thing that we can't control are the opinions of other people or the actions of other people. Obviously, if we're taking care of children or vulnerable adults, we are obligated ethically and perhaps even legally to take care of them, to protect them. But in general, we cannot control other people. We certainly can't control the future or the past. We can't control what's happening around us in many, many ways. We can try to control what other people think of us, but that's a losing bargain. And we can do our best job, but the outcome of our efforts is out of our hands once it's left our presentation. And finally, we can't really change other people's minds. That's up to them. But what we can do is create communication that allows for all sorts of connection that just might make us more understandable, perhaps more agreeable or more persuasive. So here we go. The things that are in my control, and you can see this on the slide here, are things like my boundaries, my thoughts and actions, the goals I set, what I give my energy to, how I speak to myself, and how I handle challenges. These are things that a lot of us lose track of when we start to get nervous. We begin to think that we're completely out of control because our body is telling us that it is. And so let's take a look at each of these very quickly and talk about how using your body in that relaxed way that we just did with the humming and the vocalizing, how when we relax ourselves and we have access to all of our techniques that our body provides for us, how this can then become possible. So first of all, one of the things that we can control are the boundaries that we set. And the boundaries that we set, of course, we can do this verbally, vocally. We can tell people, to stop, or we can set boundaries in terms of our time or our physical space. We can do all those things. But if our body isn't supporting that, if our voice isn't supporting that, if our carriage and our posture isn't supporting that, then the words that we give out really don't have as much power. They don't. And so one of the things about embodied communication when we're talking about setting boundaries is that we need to make sure that the voice that we're using, the carriage that we're using, the posture, the breath that we're using, all these things support the boundaries that we're trying to set. A perfect example of this is those of you who have kids. You'll know that when you are talking to a child, particularly if you want to protect them, they might be running toward the street or about to put their hand on the stove or any number of those things. You can use all the words you want, but it's the tone of voice that really carries that boundary. So if you say stop, if you use a staccato sound, usually with a quick intake and outtake of breath, that's what the child reacts to. Now, you can say things afterward, but in that moment, you can do that. In communication, for example, at work, we'll talk about these in some of my classes. Oftentimes, people will come in to perhaps ask for a raise or to talk about some challenge at work. Maybe they're having difficulty with a staff member or a colleague. And a lot of times people will come in an apologetic way. Um, they'll even say they're sorry that they have to bring this up. And that's all very human. It's very natural. But when a person is doing this and their body, their embodied communication is at odds with what they're saying, then that boundary is probably not going to be met. For example, a lot of times when people will be talking about something that's very difficult, they'll want to protect themselves. And we'll talk about this more in a second. But you'll notice that when you're trying to protect yourself, of course, your shoulders cave in. You often will hold your hands in front of your sternum. You'll find that your chin will tuck down because you are protecting this very important area around your lungs and your heart. And your breath will often become very shallow. And whether we like it or not, when somebody sees that, when another person sees that as a mammal, we immediately think, oh my, this person feels threatened. And when we see that, we can often have two reactions. One, which is a human response in some ways, is that we will feel then that we have superior power over that person. Ethically, we hope we don't use it, but we might feel that way. Or we might feel that this person doesn't really believe they deserve to have their own power. And so we often will not take them that seriously. So in terms of setting boundaries, embodied communication makes a big difference. Likewise, when we talk about having control of your thoughts and your actions, this is something that embodied communication really, really addresses. For many of us, when our bodies become threatened, and we'll talk about this in a second, we go into the fight or flight response, and that's a very normal evolutionary response. But when that happens, our executive functioning, the way for us to make decisions, that gets diminished, and instead we react to the threat, whether it's real or just perceived. And in doing so, we often will do the thing that is necessary to protect ourselves, but not necessary to help us. And you'll notice that when we are threatened, we tend to become either very loud or we become very quiet, or we become very aggressive, or we become very passive. And in doing so, we don't have access to the subtleties and the strategies that can often get us what we want, or that at least can help us express what we want. And so when we do embodied communication, when we learn to teach ourselves to relax, which we'll be talking about more of in a second, then we have access to our executive functioning. We're not merely reacting in that kind of evolutionary mammalian way. Likewise, when you talk about the goals that you set, this is something that embodied communication really addresses. Again, embodied communication is about using your whole body, not just your thoughts, not just your like I said, your executive functioning, but using your whole body to interact with the world, but also to understand yourself. And we talk about this quite a bit in some of my classes. The goals that you set, we know in our gut when something feels like it's a goal that we wish to pursue. And we also know, whether we are aware of it or not, whether we're having fear or whether we're having disgust. Now, fear tells us that something might be threatening. And if we can relax and get into our bodies, and we'll talk about how to identify where that is, if we can relax, we can then determine whether the fear is legitimate and should cause us to move away or to become more aggressive, or whether the fear is something that is simply a response to our normal narrative inside of our head that tells us that everything is threatening. A very different response, which is again an embodied response, is a feeling of disgust. And disgust comes from that word gustatory. We can feel it in our gut. It also has to do with letting out a gust of exhalation. And when something doesn't feel right to us, when something really seems wrong, when we have a gut reaction, our body will tell us by making us have a gustatory exhalation. We know that feeling. With embodied communication, we learn about that to teach us to differentiate between things that are fear-inducing and things that are disgusting. Things that are disgusting, those are usually those kind of decisions that we know aren't right. We from birth, we turn away from things that are disgusting, unappealing, that are offensive. As we become more mature and we begin to attach psychological and cognitive processes to this disgust reaction, we can begin to see situations that might not be physically disgusting, but that really do turn us away from them. So by going into our bodies, we can determine whether something is fear-inducing, whether it's legitimately fear-inducing, and whether it is disgusting and that we need to step away from it and have different goals. In terms of the energy that we give, our energy is obviously determined by our body, by our adrenaline, by the cortisol levels that we have, by the serotonin, the norepinephrine, all those different neurotransmitters and those different hormonal reactions. Those energize us or they deplete us. And again, when we learn to be aware of those things, when we learn to be aware of where they reside in our body and how they can motivate us, then we have access to all of that. And then finally, how I speak to myself and how I follow challenges. One of the things that often happens to us when we are out of our body and we're in our head, you'll hear this a lot, is that our internal monologue, our narrative becomes very, very powerful. And our internal monologue or our internal narrative can become very punishing. And when we see this merely as, not merely, we see this as the truth or as the legitimate perception of the world, and we don't check in with our body to see if this is just a response, nervous system response, then we become victims to our internal monologues. And so we have a difficult time being able to figure out when we're at fault, when we're responsible, when we are in a victim position, all these different things. We can't distinguish that. So what we can and what we can't control is important to keep in mind. So if we could have the next slide, please, that would be fantastic. The other thing about embodied communication, like I said earlier, is that it requires us to connect with ourselves, like we just talked about, but also with other people. There's a very famous study called the Moravian study, and it gets misused quite a bit. And people will say that when you're talking with other people, that the power within that communication is largely through body language. And people will say that the Moravian study said that when you're putting forth some kind of idea or you're giving a presentation, that 55% of that presentation is done through body language, 38% is through vocal tone, and 7% is through the spoken words. That's not entirely true because what you say does matter. What the Moravian study actually says is that when our words and our physicality and our vocal technique, when they are not in sync, when our body or our voice is saying something different from the words that we're using, people will pay attention to our body and to our voice. And so with embodied communication, the goal then is to find a way to relax and to be in your body so that when you speak, your body is supporting the words that you're using. Next slide, please. And so how do you get into your body? So we've set this up. We've talked about how important it is that your body support your thoughts, that you're aware of your body so that you know when your mind is perhaps even betraying you. And also you have to be aware of your body so that you can then present your material in a way that is easy to understand and that supports the message you're giving. This is a slide that I really do appreciate because it shows how powerful it is for us to be able to deal with what our body is telling us. Shanta mentioned the fight or flight response in her introduction, and this is that autonomic nervous system. We'll talk about that in just a second, but our autonomic nervous system is telling us whether we should flee, whether we should fight, whether we should flop or freeze or befriend. And some interesting research has been done on people who have a neurodivergent nervous system, people who process information differently from what are called neurotypical people. And many of us know people that we might have people in our family, we might ourselves be neurodivergent or neuroatypical. And what that means is, it means many things, but one of the things that it really means is that when we are talking to people who are neurodivergent, they have really specific and fascinating and very useful insight into how to deal with what the body is telling us or telling them, and how all of us, regardless of our neurotypicality, how we can use these things as a way to ground ourselves in our bodies and take all that energy that might be misleading us and might be interfering with the way that we speak. So these are just some simple things. This is something that you can see when you use your QR code and look at this later. But you'll notice that a lot of these different techniques for people who are neurodivergent, when they want to reset their nervous system, when they want to relax and get into their body, they're things that a lot of us do all the time, but they have really interesting commonalities. For example, when people who are neurodivergent often feel overwhelmed, it can be very helpful to chew on ice. Now, if you're a dentist out there, you can, don't use me in your waiting room because chewing on ice is not great for your teeth. However, it is something that can ground us because the ability just to move our jaw, in a very ruminative way is one way for us to relax and come into our bodies. Of course, you know the word rumination. It comes from cattle who ruminate. They chew their cud. We use it metaphorically, but in actuality, chewing like that, chewing on something that has some resistance, is a way to relax our bodies, to relax our faces, and to take us out of that fight or flight overwhelm. So chewing on ice is something that can work very well. Likewise, deep breathing. This is something that I think we could try. I'll do it. I wonder if you're doing it with me or not, because I can't see you. But a lot of times when we breathe from the diaphragm, we can oxygenate our system, and that causes us to relax, and it tells our nervous system, particularly our autonomic nervous system, the one that works automatically, that tells us that we can relax. So if you want to give this a try, you all know how to do this, I'm sure, but make a fist with your non-dominant hand. Take your dominant hand, put your dominant hand over your non-dominant hand, and then if you would, put your fist right at the bottom of your sternum, right where your rib cage makes that kind of butterfly, right there, right above your belly, your abdomen. And without pushing in, I don't want you to push the air out, but I'd like you to rest it firmly on that muscle, the diaphragm that's right there. And let's take 3 breaths together. So here we go. And we'll breathe in through our mouth. We'll breathe in through our nose, and we'll exhale through our mouth. On the count of 4, I'll count, you breathe, but really feel your fist on your diaphragm. Here we go. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4, hold it, and then breathe out. Let's do it one more time. Breathe in through your nose on the count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold it, and then breathe out through your mouth. I'm going to ask a question. I can't hear your answer, but can you feel the diaphragm resisting and expanding as you breathe in and out? One more time. Breathe in through your nose, please. Hold it, and then breathe out. And you should feel your diaphragm relax. As our diaphragms relax, our shoulders relax. Again, the muscles in our face begin to relax. Our body becomes more attuned to itself. It steps away from the nervous reaction, the nervous response, and then it gives us time to be able to use our executive functioning, to use our thoughts. So being able to take deep breaths. Those of you who either have family members on the autism spectrum or work with people in the autism spectrum, or if you're on the spectrum yourself, you know that people can stim through it, which is, of course, an abbreviation for stimulation. There's a lot of benefit to simply shaking your hands, shaking your body. A lot of us do that, shake it out. Very typical. Likewise, doing things like simply tapping. We'll talk about this in a second, but tapping your body in a rhythmic way. One of the things that this does for all of us is that it puts us in our bodies and it disrupts the neural pathways that are telling us that we're in danger, or that's telling us that we are prey, or that tells us that we are overwhelmed. So simply doing something that is rhythmic, that is physical, that involves something that is outside of a story, that doesn't buy into the story that our body's telling us or that our mind is telling us, this can help us relax. Very quickly, cold showers, cold water, it increases vagal tone. You know this, that putting a splash in your face with cold water is a great way to relax. Oftentimes before a speech, if you're not too worried about makeup and things like that, you can splash water on your face, take a deep breath, and then feel the tingling in your face. This will relax your face and again, give you access to the facial muscles and also to your voice. Hum, chant, sing, we did that, put on music and dance, spending time with your pet, you know, the oxytocin that comes the from petting an animal, very, very powerful. Going on a walk. Now, these are simple things that we can do. And you'll notice a lot of times people do it without thinking about it. They'll pace back and forth before having to make a presentation. This is more than just getting energy out. It actually is doing something called bilateral stimulation. So when you can move your body, here's your midline. If you can move your body in opposing ways, either through your arms or your legs or both, as you do when you're walking, what that tends to do is it tends to diminish the neural pathways that are telling you the stories that are usually filled with anxiety. For example, swimming is a great exercise for that because you're constantly moving in opposing ways across your midline. It's a way to let go of that anxiety, to deal with it honestly and openly. And then finally, holding a cold fan in front of your face. There's a lot of evidence that cold air, cold water, simply that feeling of something cold going over your body, that this is a way that relaxes us. Anyway, these are things that people who again are neurodivergent, they talk about, and they help those of us who are also dealing with those same kind of issues, perhaps not as consistently or in such a dramatic fashion, but they're very insightful, they're very useful, and they are available to us all the time. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we can do all these things. The other thing that we can do to become more embodied in our communication is to develop what is called an improvisational mindset. And I spend a lot of time improvising, teaching it, doing it, thinking about it. But the improvisational mindset is also based on embodied communication. And so I'm going to talk about 3 things that you can think about and then that you can then translate into physicality so that you can have this as a tool when you need to become more embodied to connect with other people and also to relax yourself. So first of all, if we want to have an embodied moment, we want to be in our bodies and be able to communicate effectively using our bodies, the first thing we have to do is acknowledge the moment. In improvisation, we always say yes to the moment, recognize what's happening, and then be honest about it. This is absolutely true if we want to get into our bodies and out of our heads. And one of the things that happens for us when we become agitated or when we become confused or we have either too much mental activity or we have brain fog is that our bodies are telling us that something is happening and we feel threatened. So in improvisation, what we do is we would acknowledge that. We would acknowledge the fact that maybe we're having shallow breathing, or we would acknowledge the fact that before we have a major presentation or a major conversation, or we're coming into a tense situation, we acknowledge that our body is protecting itself by tensing up and by being ready to fight, to flee or to fight. If we can acknowledge that, if we, instead of saying, what's wrong with me or trying to think it through, if we begin with our body by acknowledging where the tension is, then we can do the next thing, which is we can breathe. We can use some of those techniques we talked about earlier. We can allow ourselves to envision what's happening and to allow it to dissipate. So for example, let's say that you are giving a speech, you're nervous about it. You can feel your body shaking. You are taking shallow breaths. You feel this anxiety, which often feels like sort of almost like a fist in the either the pit of your stomach, or for some of us, it's right in the middle of our rib cage, often over our heart. In improvisation, we always say that's where you are. That's where you start. There's nothing wrong with being there. You don't want to be there, but there's nothing wrong with that. And you then begin to ask yourself these kind of questions. Where in my body is this happening? I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling this knot in my stomach. And what we do is then we take a second and we acknowledge the knot, we think about it, we visualize it, and then we sit with it. And we don't try to think about, what the knot is telling us or what our narrative is telling us. Instead, we sit with our body, we feel the knot, we recognize that it's there, and then we let it dissipate. And it's amazing how powerful that can be. Likewise, a lot of us, I'm certainly one of these people that when I get nervous, I jut my chin and I chew. That rumination that we talked about. A lot of times, in order for us to have true embodied communication, we have to recognize and acknowledge what's happening to us. A lot of times I'm unaware of it until, 3 or 4 hours into it, but then I'll think, God, my jaw is really tight. The minute I acknowledge it and I stop thinking about what my muscles are telling me, I just picture it and I acknowledge it. That takes some of the power out of it, and then I can begin to let that dissipate. I can begin to feel my jaw relaxing. I can actually feel the tension that is being fueled by my nervous system and by my hormonal activity and my neurotransmitter activity. I can feel it begin to ventilate. I can feel it go away. So the first thing we need to do is we need to acknowledge what's happening with us. And this can be very important for us. Could I have the next slide, please? The next thing that we need to do then is we need to become aware of the narratives that we begin to create because our body is telling us that we're under threat. And one of the things that we do as improvisers is we practice radical non-judgment. So when I'm feeling nervous, or when I'm working with students who are really nervous about having to do a show or a presentation or any kind of like a verbal exam or something, the first thing that we do is we practice being non-judgmental about what's happening. Instead of saying, "Oh, I'm such an idiot. I'm always so nervous. I can't figure this out." And instead we say, "Oh, okay. My body is telling me that I'm under threat." And we just acknowledge it. We don't run with it. We just acknowledge it. And then we become curious, like I said earlier. Where is this happening? Where is my body telling me this? Is it in my abdomen? Is it in my gut? Is it in my digestive system? And we take just a second and we begin to let that go. We just go into our body, we feel where it is. And instead of saying, I wish I didn't feel this way, or I don't want to feel this way, we let it go. Those of you who struggle with migraines, and migraines are horrible, or really bad sinus headaches, I'm not saying that this is a cure for those, but a lot of research shows that if we can identify where the pain is, and instead of resisting it either cognitively or physically, and just allow ourselves to kind of throb with it, a lot of times that will begin to lessen it. And then we are able then to harness all the executive functioning again that we need. The last thing, and this is very important, is that in improvisation, our goal is always to make our audience and our scene members look as good as possible. We want people to be as open, and we want them to be as participatory, and we want them to be as creative as possible. And we hope that other people will allow that for us. And so if we could have the next slide to the make your audience look good, that would be fantastic. Thank you, thank you, thank you. One of the things about this is that with embodied communication, we always, if we want to have connection and communication, we let our body do the work first. We lean forward, perhaps in an appropriate way. We have eye contact. We pay attention to the muscles around our eyes. We do this in improvisation all the time. What is my face saying? Is it intense? Is it happy? Is it angry? But we let this happen. And the more that we become aware of this, and the more that we are intentional, not manipulative, but intentional in the physical communication that we're sending to another person, the more likely it is that we will be heard, and the more likely it is that the other person will be able to communicate with us. I'll use an example that I love. From birth, we are programmed to look for other people's mirroring our experience. And if you're holding a baby, and I always have my students hold a baby, you can do that if you like. And you know that when we look at babies, we begin to mirror them. Our eyes get big, our mouth gets small, our foreheads get wrinkled, and then we begin to talk like them. All these things that mirror and mimic the baby. We do it. It's evolutionary, it's a mammalian response, but it's also something that we never lose. And I always ask my students this: how long does it take for a baby to panic if we don't mirror them, if we present a blank face? And research shows that from birth, it's within 3 or 4 seconds. We never lose that as adults. We don't panic, we don't cry necessarily, although some of us might. But when we connect with people, we want to mirror them and we want them to mirror us. We want to be able to connect with people in a way that uses all those muscles around our eyes and our forehead and our chin. We want to use that mellifluous, melodious voice. We want all of that if we want to connect. If you don't want to connect, if you want to be able to control, and sometimes that's appropriate, then you would use a different face. But the thing is, if we do it intentionally and if we do it consciously, then we have control over that and we can do it ethically. If we do it unconsciously, then we risk, either getting our message garbled or we risk hurting another person. Could I have the next slide, please? So the thing that we need to do is we need to befriend our nervous system. And I've mentioned this, Shanta mentioned this at the beginning. Our autonomic nervous system, the one that part of our nervous system that controls our breathing, our circulatory system, our digestion, that this is something that really does control us. We'd be lost without it. So our responses are human, they're mammalian, they're important. But what happens for a lot of us is that when we get nervous, our autonomic nervous system sends us into either fight or flight or freeze or flop or friend. And when we are in one of those F situations, we do not have access to the executive functioning, to the cognitive skills that we normally do, and it tends to interrupt and sometimes completely derail us. So let's take a look at this. You all know those feelings that when you feel threatened and your body goes into action, it's not a great place to be. All of us, have, I would imagine, have had situations or examples of where we've had to give a speech and we have completely panicked and we've blanked, or we've come across as much more harsh than we meant to, or we've been very apologetic, or we have missed an opportunity to connect with other people because our body is telling us that it's under threat. And so what we do as embodied communicators is we try to distinguish while it's happening, when it begins, what part of the autonomic nervous system we are embodying. So fight or flight, we all know. Fight or flight is when our adrenaline gets going, our amygdala is pulsing with nervous energy. We have shallow breaths, our hands are clenched. It's a situation that is very useful when we need to direct ourselves and direct other people away from danger or confront danger. But in most communication, it results either in passivity, not even passivity, in flight, or in aggression. But what is more common for people, particularly at work or in relationships, is they, instead of going into fight or flight, they will often go into either freeze, flop, or friend. So let's talk about that very quickly. Freezing is when we become immobile. It's exactly what it sounds like. Our mind goes blank. You've all had that experience, I would imagine, where you're trying to find the word and you're terrified and you're frozen. What we do through embodied communication is when that happens, when the freezing happens, we do something physical that is not connected to our thoughts. So for example, we might do this with our thumbs. If you want to do this with me, you overlap your thumbs like this, you put it on your sternum, you put your fingertips up right by your clavicle, and you do a very, very slow tap. This comes as a neurodiverse response that a lot of people will use. And the more you can do this, the more you can do something physical, the more that you can use your body in a way that is not in response to your nervous system, the more likely it is that you will break that nervous pattern, that your neural pathways will become disrupted and you'll begin to breathe. In improvisation, we always say, reach for something, do something. If you find yourself frozen, do anything. And that's true for embodied communication as well. Flopping is usually in response to pain. When we stop and when we flop, when we do that, one of the things that tends to happen is we tend to stop breathing. And so when we find our bodies doing that, It's important to go back to that thing we talked about of doing that diaphragmatic breathing, feeling your diaphragm expanding and contracting while you take deeper and deeper breaths. This often will get people out of that flop response, and then they can identify their pain. And then finally, the most interesting thing that happens is the friending response. And the friending response, in some ways, is a little bit more evolutionarily elevated than the other ones. But this is where a person will feel a threat and they will try to understand the predator or the threat. And so they will often lean forward, they will open their body up, and they will often use their body to protect the more vulnerable people behind them, whether this is actually happening or not. You might just be at work, but that leaning forward, trying to understand. When that happens, it's also important to be able to locate where the anxiety is in your body. With the friend response, it's often much more in the face. We can feel it in our foreheads, around our eyes, in our chin and in our jaw. And the ability to breathe and to relax that part, it gives you the power that you need to be able then to determine whether this is a real threat and then what to do from there. Could we have the next slide, please? This is all based on social engagement. We talked a little bit about that, but we have access to our eyes, our foreheads, our mouths, our posture, our voice. We are constantly looking to other people to find ways to engage with them, and it's often unconscious. I will say this before we move to the next slide, because we're running out of time. One of the places that is most important when you're engaging in social engagement, two places, is the voice. Like I said, that humming can be perfect if you're getting ready for either a presentation or a confrontation, to be able to loosen your voice so that you have access to all of your range. When we're in the fight, flight, or flop response or freeze, any of those, we tend to become very, very focused. Men will often talk from the back of their throats. Women will tend to talk, and these are generalizations, but tend to talk more from the nasal cavity. When we have access to all of that, then we can gather people's attention and talk to them more easily. The other place that we feel this is around the eyes, and this is often controlled both by the jaw and by the forehead. When the muscles around the eyes tighten, either through the jaw or through the forehead, we will often either begin to look more threatening, or we will, it affects our hearing, actually. It affects the bones in our middle ear. We won't be able to hear the nuances in the voice of the person who's speaking to us, and then we will misinterpret that often. So social engagement is about being aware of your body, breathing, and being able to use that. A couple more slides here. Dialectical thinking, you all know that, of course, is the ability to hold contradictory emotions, contradictory thoughts at the same time. This is one of the things that embodied communication gives us the power to do. When we locate where we are having either the stress or the anger or the affection in our body, when we know that and we can identify it and we can begin then to, without judgment, let that be, then we can very easily hold two thoughts at the same time. Yeah, I'm nervous to do this, but I'm also excited to do it. My body might be telling me to freeze or to flee, but when I can breathe and when I can feel the muscles in my shoulders relax and my back relax, then I can look at the situation and say, yeah, of course I can hold two things at the same time. Embodied communication, it gives you access to your highest cognitive functioning. Next slide, please. The other thing too about embodied communication is that it allows us to play what are called infinite games. Finite games have winners and losers. They're great. The Vikings are always playing a finite game, sometimes not to our in ways that makes us happy. But an infinite game is a game where the goal is always to keep making connections and keeping the game alive and going. So when we are using our bodies, we are constantly bringing in new information. We are constantly trying to absorb new information, and we're trying to keep the conversation alive. And then our last slide with play theory. The more we become embodied, the more playful we become. You'll notice that children, they'll of course they use language, and they love to use language in ways that is funny, and they use songs and they love rhymes and nonsense. Adults do as well. But when you're using your entire body, then you can let go of that win or lose mentality, that right or wrong mentality, that rigid mentality that so many of us have to have in order to get by in this adult world. But when your body is relaxed and when it is giving you information that tells you you're not under threat, then you can play, and then you can begin to negotiate and strategize and connect and laugh, and win and lose with grace. So that's all I have to say. Shanta, I think you're going to do a Q&A here. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. Thank you so much for these great suggestions. I find myself oftentimes, even with these webinars, that I have to like prepare myself for public speaking. So definitely going to take some of these examples away.
Yeah, if you want to do this while you're talking, you go right ahead. That's fine.
Yeah, right. Just like on my chest. So yes, we'll move on to questions now. I do want to apologize to anyone if I don't make it to your questions. I do have a few here. I also put there in the chat if you have questions that you want to ask, please send it to ccaps.umn.edu and then we can pass them on to Jim if we don't get to them. So our first question is regarding connecting before content. Can you talk a little bit more about how to do this with written communication, specifically email?
That's a great question. I think email is slightly different, but one of the things that I think a lot of us are finding out now that we're email bound is that when people look at an email, the first thing they look at is the space between the sentences and the length of the email. And one way that you can connect before you use content, that I'm desperately terrible at, is to write short emails that have a lot of space between each sentence. So when you open it, you say, oh, okay, there are 3 sentences here. I have time for this. I know that most of us, if we see an email that is very long and that has a lot of bullet points, it might be great information, but our first response is often, I don't have time for this. I'm not going to be able to absorb this. And so to create a visual space, the word that I love that gets used a lot in embodied communication is ventilating. If you can send a ventilated email where people can look at it and say, oh, there's a lot of space. There are a few things I need to know. That usually makes people much more predisposed to get that information.
Great, thank you. So another question here is, there are many times that patrons at my library read my voice, inflection, and volume as negative. Though my body language may be perceived as welcoming, my question is, can this be due to gendered expectations? Asked another way, is there gendered communication expectations of normal volume as a woman or as opposed to a man? I think you kind of touched on that a little bit, but yeah.
Absolutely. It's not fair at all. And I do think that women's voices get criticized and evaluated in ways that men's don't. And that's a shame. It's really a shame. But what is also interesting, if you look at work on embodied communication, is you'll find that women tend to be much better at it because they have this is such a generalization, so forgive me, but tend to have a much greater range of speech. They can use their lower voice, their chest voice, their head voice. American men in particular, we all tend to talk from the back of our throats. And that can come across as, I don't know, authoritative sometimes, but that really puts us at a disadvantage in terms of relational or emotional speech. But yes, it's I'm so sorry about that. It is unfair. It's unfair. And I do think women in the public sphere suffer from it in ways that men don't.
Okay, our next question is regarding the idea of narratives. Is there a way to tell if a fear or gut feeling we are experiencing is legitimate or if it's only a narrative we are telling ourselves?
There are ways to tell if it's in many ways you have to actually go through the experience to find out, that's not all that helpful at all. However, I will say this, as somebody who has dealt with a lot of anxiety, a lot of us have, certainly in the past few years, my narrative has become pretty negative in all the times. There's a lot of things that are going on with the pandemic and politics and all those sort of things. And one way to tell if the internal narrative is legitimate, they're all legitimate, but if it's actually talking about a real thing, is to give yourself the time to relax Let your body relax first. Identify where that anxiety is, and then ask questions like, is this true? What is the worst thing that can happen? Have I felt this before? Do I have enough information? But we can't ask those questions if our body is saying, fear, 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 fear. So the ability to evaluate those things, particularly around anxiety and fear, I think is true. As far as our gut response, that gustatory response I was talking about, I do think that is that is, I don't want to say it's infallible, but that's very strong. And that is primal. And so I would imagine it's a good idea to really trust that.
Mm.
Think about it afterwards, but really trust it when it's happening.
Okay. And how should I handle when I become scared when an audience asks a tough question during a presentation?
Like this one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ready, set, go.
What I have found, that's such a great question. That is a great question. I do the three things I talked about. First of all, I acknowledge the fear, and sometimes I'll even do what I did just now. I'll say, "Wow, that is a big question." First of all, to acknowledge the fear, but also to give me some time to think about it. What I do while I'm talking is I always try to make it as conversational as possible, meaning that I try to see the person if I can. I become aware of my breath. I become aware of what my body is doing. And if it's a question that I can't answer, either because I don't know the answer or because I need more time, I try to be honest about it. And your body, like, this is the body communication. Your body will tell you, you
Yeah.
know,
Okay. I'm looking at time here. Okay, we're still doing it. What do you look for in your audience that would indicate you are delivering embodied communication?
it's usually the way they're sitting. If they're leaning forward, that's great. Sometimes you don't know. I teach at 8 in the morning at the U, and I would say that I have not reached a single student ever because it's 8 in the morning, and then they'll often in the evaluations they'll say what a good time they had. I'm being facetious a little bit, but usually if you can get people to lean forward, laughter is obviously a sign that you've connected in some way. What I tend to do is I tend to ask questions right off the bat. And what I've done now is I will often have people do a brief little physical exercise of some sort at the beginning of a class or at the beginning of a speech, just to get people connected. I also will have people, it's almost like being in church where you look around and you bless other people. I'll have people look at each other and connect with each other, and if they can feel as if they are a group and they're with me, the group mind, not group think, but the group mind will often encourage people to connect.
Okay. So this actually leads nicely into the next. With so many virtual interactions, it can be difficult to read the reactions of people in rooms, especially when others do not have cameras turned on. Do you have any tips about how to deal with a type of situation where you don't really know um, if what you're saying is landing with the audience?
That's a tough one. I do a lot of this kind of work, and that is a tough one. When I'm doing this on my own, I will have the chat function open all the time, and I will ask a question every 5 minutes just to get people to go on the chat.
Yeah,
Um, it's tough.
yeah.
Yeah.
Engaging chat, I think that, which I felt was in this presentation. So it sounds like you're doing a good job here, Jim. So there are quite a lot of other questions, but unfortunately we don't have enough time to get to all of those. So as I mentioned earlier, please pass those along to ccapsinfo@umn.edu and we can get those over to Jim. If you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So thanks again, Jem, for your incredible useful information. And it was a pleasure having you here today with us. As I mentioned earlier, we'll send a link to the webinar recording within a week of today's webinar. The recording will also be posted to our CCAPS webinar, webinar archive, as well as our CCAPS YouTube page. We also have our QR code listed here for UMN employees. If you want to access the well-being points, please scan that QR code. Otherwise, thank you all for joining us today, and you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. I had a great time. Thank you.
Thank you.